In earlier versions of SQL Server, Management Studio was an optional feature that you could install when installing other components of SQL Server, including the database engine. But over the last few years, Microsoft has unbundled Management Studio from the rest of the product, so you need to download and install it separately. It's always been a standalone feature. You could install it separately on a machine to be able to manage instances of SQL Server on remote servers. But now that point is made forcibly clear by this unbundling. The real benefit of the unbundling is that Microsoft now updates Management Studio much more frequently than it does versions of SQL Server, so they can add new features much more quickly. In fact, they have sometimes released new versions as often as monthly, and often implement new features for new versions of SQL Server before that new version of SQL Server or is close to shipping. Once you've installed Management Studio on the local machine, all you need to do to open it up is come here to the Programs menu, or the Start menu in Windows, which should open. Scroll down here to Microsoft SQL Server 2016. Expand that, and you can start it directly from there. But frankly, anytime I pave or repave my development machine, I use Management Studio so often that what I normally do is I just put it down here in the taskbar. So I'll start it up from there. And that loads the Connect to Server dialog box. Now in this case, I'm going to connect to this local server name, but I can put in an IP address here, I can put in a machine name that has an instance of a SQL Server running, whatever. And I'm also in this case going to use the default Windows authentication, but I've installed this instance of SQL Server using both Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication. And as you can see, you can also connect using Active Directory. But in this case, I'm a local admin on this local machine, so it's easiest just to use Windows authentication. That way, I have access to all of the features in this instance of SQL Server. But if I needed to actually log in, I could select SQL Server Authentication. That enables these boxes right here, and I put in my login and password. And I can remember the password if I want to. Really, the most important thing about this dialog box is that SQL Server is secure. It's designed as a secure server environment. And so you need to authenticate yourself against the instance of SQL Server in order to be able to do anything on that instance. Now, one interesting thing of historical note is that in earlier versions of Management Studio, this dialog box mentioned the version of SQL Server that was up through SQL Server 2012 that it was associated with. Because again, you would typically install Management Studio as part of installing SQL Server itself. You could install just Management Studio on a separate machine, but you would have to fire up the SQL Server installation disk. That's changed because it's now a standalone component, and so it doesn't mention which version of SQL Server this is associated with. Because I can install this and I can access any version of SQL Server that I want to. Okay, so a standalone project, and that's probably the only visible evidence of that. All right, so now if you need additional connection options, you can select this option button there. And as you can see, that expands the dialog box, gives a few more tabs, a couple more tabs, as well as additional options for customizing the connection to the instance of SQL Server. Now, most of the time, you're probably not going to worry about these additional options unless your SQL Server instance is configured with custom settings. All right, and then this additional connection parameters let you really get freeform. Typically, you're only going to use this tab here with data providers to databases that, well, really are outside the norm of the connection properties that it requires. So frankly, I connect with a lot of different kinds of databases, not just SQL Server, and I can't remember if I've ever used this at all. So don't worry about it. Just remember that it's there in case you need to provide any specialized kind of parameters. But otherwise, you're mostly just going to be working with the Login tab here. but sometimes you may need to use those connection properties as well. All right, now in this case, as I mentioned, I'm connecting to a local instance. I'm using Windows Authentication because I'm a local admin on this instance of Windows 10. So I'll go ahead and connect. So that's fairly quick because, again, I'm running against a local machine. But if you're going across the network, particularly across the internet, which you can certainly do with Management Studio, then it may take a little bit more time to go out and do the handshake and the back and forth negotiation to authenticate you against a different instance of SQL Server. Okay, so once you've connected to an instance of SQL Server, by default, you'll see that the Object Explorer appears here. I'll go ahead and widen this a little bit. So what the Object Explorer does is it displays information for all servers that this instance of Management Studio is connected to and presents it in a hierarchical tree view. So I'm not limited to connecting to just a single instance. If I want to connect to another instance of SQL Server, I could click on the database engine. I'd get that Connect to Server dialog box. I could put in a different machine name. I'm not going to connect anything here. And then if I successfully authenticate against that instance, then that instance of SQL Server will be listed here. And I can essentially connect to as many instances of SQL Server on this or any other machine as I want. So that's a really handy feature, particularly if you're going back and forth looking at the database structures and the data in two different instances of SQL Server. It's pretty rare that I connect to more than two, but you can connect to as many as you want to. Object Explorer is right-click enabled, so I can right-click just about any place and get a custom menu for that particular item. So this is real handy. You'll be doing this all the time as you work with Management Studio because it gives you direct access to most of the things that you can do with Management Studio, and that's a lot of stuff. Now, one thing about what appears here in Object Explorer. The nodes that appear depend on the features of SQL Server, features that you've installed, and I haven't installed all features of SQL Server, so conceivably there's some additional things that could appear here. But it also depends on the permissions that you have. I have administrative rights within this instance of SQL Server, so I have complete permissions to do everything that's possible in this instance. But if I'm a more limited user, maybe I have permissions just in a single database, I can't do various other management functions, that's going to change the nodes that appear here. So, particularly if you're following along at home and looking at your installation and you're connected to an instance of SQL Server where you don't have administrative rights, first of all, that's probably not going to work for a lot of parts of this course, but you may have something that appears a little bit differently. Also, because Microsoft is updating Management Studio so frequently, just be aware that the overall appearance may look slightly different. But if you're using this within the time frame of SQL Server 2016 being a current product, then it's probably going to look pretty similar to what I'm showing you. Okay, so let's talk about the databases node and kind of talk about more about what all is included in here. So what I've done is I clicked on the little tree view plus sign and it turned into a minus, so I can toggle that, just usual tree view. And it shows all of the databases that are installed in this instance of SQL Server. Notice that there's a separate section for system databases. Those are some standard databases that are installed with every instance of SQL Server. And then all of these are what are called user databases. Strictly speaking, Report Server is part of reporting services. That's sort of a system database, but it's there because I installed reporting services on this instance of SQL Server. But then all of these other databases are user databases that I created and imported data into. Okay, so we'll be spending a lot of time with databases in this course. The next note I want to point out is security. An important part of managing SQL Server is to properly configure and control its security features. Generally, you can manage security at two levels, at the server level and at the database level. So what this note here is because this is not in the context of any database, This allows you to perform various actions at the server level, specifically at the instance level. And so you can do things like create logins. You can assign server roles, which are essentially groups of permissions that you can assign to different users and so forth. And you can also manage credentials, the login, how users have to log in, and do a lot of other security kind of tasks here. But again, this is only going to be available to you if you have administrative rights or some of the specific security-related permissions that you need to perform those kinds of actions. All right, now I'm going to go back into the databases node, and I'll do that, and I'll look at the Wide World Importers, which is a new database that was introduced with SQL Server 2016. The AdventureWorks databases date back to earlier versions of SQL Server. They're still useful, which is why I've installed them here on this machine. So notice that within this database, within the context of this database, I also have a security node. So again, this is within the context of the Wide World Importers database. This lets you define users' roles, schemas, asymmetric keys, certificates, and various other kinds of encryption features where you can manage those features for this database. And you can also do things like define audit specifications for this database. So as you proceed through the course and learn more about security, keep those two things in mind. As you learn more about how SQL Server secures its data, as well as the objects within the server, you'll begin to understand what the difference is between these two security nodes, one within the context of the database and the other within the context of the server instance. Okay, so let me collapse those. And then next look at server objects. So this is where you can manage communication channels with external resources and maintain backup devices. So this is essentially a lot of different kinds of server level maintenance tasks that you can perform. And you can do things like define endpoints, which allows applications to, for example, across HTTP, across the web on the internet, to access features of this instance of SQL Server. So you would define those endpoints here. You can also link to other servers, which is essentially a way of allowing applications that can access this server to get access to the data on other servers as well. And you can also define server level triggers, which is code that executes in response to various kinds of events on the server and so forth. Okay, next note I want to point out here in this high-level overview is replication. So this contains folders for managing local publications and subscriptions. Replication provides an automated way of keeping multiple versions of a database synchronized. So within an instance of SQL Server, you can publish data and define what data is published. It doesn't need to be all of the data within a database, which then other instances of SQL Server can subscribe to. And using these local publications and local subscriptions is how you define that replication. All right, another thing that you'll probably use at times is the management node here. This is where you'll find your maintenance plans for backing up SQL Server databases, various kinds of maintenance activities, checking data, validating it, rebuilding indexes, and performing actions like that. And then you can also find the logs here, define how data information is logged, as well as the activity monitor, which gives you a high-level view of what's going on within this instance of SQL Server. All right, so that's a high-level view of the Object Explorer, and we'll be using this a lot more throughout the rest of the course.